Cool. So welcome, everybody. I'm so excited to be here. I'm so grateful that you all are interested in this topic. Bill is a hard act to follow, but I'm going to do my best. I don't have that energy level ever, but I'm going to do my best to entertain you and give you some good value. So hopefully you're in the right spot. This is From Complexity to Clarity. We're going to talk about the business value of user experience today. Everybody good? And if you're not in the right spot, stick around. I think you'll enjoy it. So we start with the safe harbor. If you see anything in here that might be forward-looking, if you're not familiar with it, don't make any purchasing decisions. It's not a promise. It's not a delivery roadmap item, potentially. I don't think there's much forward-looking in my presentation, but we have to always include it. So my name's Chad Bishop. I'm the Senior Manager of Product Design for the Workflow suite of products, which include Flow Designer, Playbook Designer, Action Designer, Decision Builder. And then I'm also responsible for the Mobile Builder team, which includes Mobile App Builder, Mobile Card Builder, and Mobile Publishing. And I've been at ServiceNow for about 3 years, and before that I was with an implementation partner, a user experience implementation partner, where we worked with many, many customers, potentially some of you here, to do portal implementations, custom portal implementations on ServiceNow. So let's start with a little level setting, a little housekeeping. So what is user experience? Let's all agree on the definition. So user experience operates at the intersection of the business, the admin and the developers, and the user. So good UX really perfectly balances those three priorities. So is it a priority? Is it feasible? And is it usable? And when all three of those priorities are balanced and met equally, you have a fantastic user experience. And the important thing to note is this can be an organizational commitment. This can be many people in many departments solving the problem in this way, or it can be a single person. So anytime you're creating a user experience, these are the priorities that you're trying to balance, even as an individual contributor. Because the goal, ultimately, is to create value for the business and for the end user. So why should we prioritize UX? A few years ago, a company called McKinsey did a watershed study with 300 public companies over a 5-year period, and they found that companies that prioritized UX consistently and significantly outperformed not only their market and their industry, not only their industry, but also the general market at large. And I'll have links to all of this content at the end, so you can go check these references and read up on all of this yourself if you want afterwards. And they found that the companies that did this well generally executed on these three categories. They had consistent execution on these three categories. The first one was user centricity. So the building digital experiences, they focused on the user. They used it to minimize the biases and to help prioritize their efforts. They were analytical, meaning they measured. They measured the outcomes to determine whether what they did was successful, but then also to guide their decision making in the future. And then they lowered the cost of development. They lowered the cost of iteration, which allowed them to iterate rapidly and continuously improve. So they broke it down into smaller chunks, but it operated in a more agile manner. So let's talk about a few success stories. Bank of America was able to increase their form conversion rate, driving revenue, by 26% through improving their UX. And I like to kind of flip this the other way and think of it as if they had 100,000 potential applicants to drive revenue, they were potentially losing 26,000 of them. And by improving the user experience, they converted those additional 26,000 into revenue. Amazon Web Services published a study that showed that companies can lose approximately 35% of potential revenue with bad UX in their digital experiences. And then if we switch that a little bit more towards internal, operational, employee experiences, Nielsen Norman found in their study that poorly designed interfaces, employee interfaces, can cost the company an average of $13 per hour per employee. And if you think about that, if you have 20,000, 50,000, 100,000 employees, that number can add up really quickly. And then the Human Factors International, to kind of dive in a little deeper into like dev work and implementation costs, Human Factors International found that up to 50% of dev work could be avoidable if you focused early on UX and learned what the priorities are, how to solve the right problems for the right users in the right order as early as possible. And that the cost of fixing UX problems can increase by up to 100 times higher post-implementation. So while on the previous slide, we talked about continuous improvement, continuous iteration, this demonstrates it's still very important to kind of learn early and not kind of rely on the iteration, because it can be a very expensive way to operate. Everybody can hear me okay? Okay. This is different. So as user experience folks, I'll hear myself, we focus on the user first. So, and it's no different in this conversation. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to focus on the user. We're not going to talk about driving revenue, B2C. We're going to talk about the business user. And specifically, we're going to talk about productivity, which is what ServiceNow really excels at, really driving productivity and helping you all drive productivity. And solving business problems to drive that productivity. So most commonly, they focus on things like time to value, like how can we help the users accomplish their goal, their job, as quickly as possible, and work more efficiently or get back to their job that they were originally trying to do. How can we drive efficiency? And then how can we, the broad statement is just how can we drive better business outcomes like KPIs? So we're going to specifically talk about, all of this will be contextualized to really increasing margin and driving a better bottom line. So we're not going to talk about the revenue driving anymore. So now that we're focused on productivity tools, how can good UX impact the business? Well, it can drive productivity up. We've already talked about that a little bit. You can work more efficiently. You can adopt things faster. You can retain, meaning you're not jumping from tool to tool or always looking out for the better thing. And that all improves productivity. You can drive cost savings. I keep going closer to the mic. You can drive costs down. So when tools are hard to use, cost of training, cost of learning. Now I can't hear myself. Can you all still hear me? Okay. So when UX is difficult, additional costs become the priority. So you have to spend more money on learning, on documentation, on training, on onboarding. You have to spend more money on change management to help incentivize the users to adopt your tool, and so you have to build programs around that. And that can all be very expensive. But with good UX, users want to use the tool. They see the value. They see the benefit. You also will reduce errors. So, the request fulfill kind of portal agent paradigm, the bad UX can cause a lot of rework, a lot of manual reassignments, a lot of additional intervention that costs the company time and money. And then indirectly, you can save money through just reducing the learning curve of the individual employee using that specific tool. If it follows their mental models, if it's easier to understand, they can do it and get back to work as quickly as possible. And then it reduces support costs. So they're not having to reach out to other people. If it's not the help desk, maybe their peers, maybe on Slack or Teams. They're not having to spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to do things. And the most important part is this all drives scalable growth. So if you solve this problem once, it's not only solved for that user in that moment, but it's solved for weeks, months, and years going forward, which ultimately has a continuous effect on the bottom line. So let me start with a story before we dig any deeper. So you may have heard it already. Simon Sinek, I think, has told this story, but he has a little different context. So it's a story of two lumberjacks. Every day the two lumberjacks go to work. They have the same tool. They have the same skill level. And every day the second lumberjack leaves for an hour. So he's actually taking an hour off in the eyes of the first lumberjack. He comes back, goes back to work, and every day, consistently, the second lumberjack outperforms the first one. He cuts down more trees every day. And finally, the first lumberjack turns to him and says, "How do you do it? I work more than you. I work harder than you. I'm here more hours, working as hard as I can. You leave for an hour, and you still outperform me." And the other lumberjack answers, "I'm sharpening my axe." So that story is usually told as a story of personal optimization, personal growth. Never stop growing, never stop learning, never stop challenging yourself, finding a better way to do things. I think this is a little bit of a different story. I think it's a story of utility, the axe, the tool, the productivity tool that the lumberjack is using, and it's a story of usability. He sharpens it, and because he takes the time to sharpen it, his productivity is dramatically and consistently increased. Now, I know innovation is important. Utility of new tools is important. In the future, now we have chainsaws. That's a much better option than an axe, obviously. You can be much more productive with the chainsaw. And in the future, who knows? Maybe we'll have lightsabers, and you'll be able to, cut through the tree like butter, zero effort. Innovation is important. But the sharpening of the axe, while that's the tool you have, is also equally important. And I'll kind of close this story with a quote. Abraham Lincoln famously said, "If I had 6 hours to chop down a tree, I'd spend the first 4 hours sharpening the axe." He wants to make cutting down that tree as easy as possible, and that's user experience. So how do we systematize this? How do we start to think about this utility, usability thing in a formalized way? Well, there's a UX pyramid that you might have heard of. I kind of think of it as climbing the UX mountain. And you start with functional. Is it functional? You start with the utility. Does it do what I need it to do? And then once you accomplish that goal, you ask yourself, is it usable? Can the user actually use it? Can they figure out how to use it to do what they need to do? And then if you really want to drive that retention and drive that adoption and drive that engagement and enjoyment, you ask, is it enjoyable? Does the user actually want to use it? Not do they have to use it because it's the corporate approved tool, but do they want to use it? And that's where real, solid, meaningful user experience comes in. So we kind of alluded to this already, but what happens when you have functional, but you don't have usable, and therefore you don't have enjoyable? Well, you lose productivity and you increase costs. So what I want to propose, and what we're going to talk about, is taking a more holistic approach to usability and utility. And if you can get to it, enjoyment, fantastic. But let's at least take a holistic approach to utility and usability. I might have to move over here. So I love this example because in the early 70s, they created the Martian or the lunar rover. It was the epitome of innovation of its day, right? It was bleeding edge technology to be able to drive on the moon. So it had all kinds of utility so that they could accomplish all kinds of things during their time on the moon. But they had to focus on usability because these astronauts were 200,000 miles away. There was no support. There was no one to call. There was no they had limited oxygen supply. They couldn't stop and read the manual. So they spent a lot of time and effort and money and energy making sure that the tool was not only serving the utility side, but also that it was very usable so that they could efficiently do what they needed to do. I know the stakes aren't that high for us. Nobody's going to run out of oxygen. But it's an important example, I think, to kind of perfectly drive home the point that you can't have one and ignore the other. So let's look at a specific example. So during my time at the partner company, We worked with 20 or 30 companies to do custom portal implementations for their, or to kind of revamp their portal implementation. And the portal's fantastic. Like, architecturally, it has a lot of good utility. It has a catalog or catalogs. It has knowledge base or knowledge bases. It has a built-in search. It has ticket tracking, and it has approval delegation. So all of those things, when put together, offer phenomenal utility to the user. But what happens when usability breaks down? What are the most common usability problems that I saw? So most of the time, the most common problem that we heard was that users just couldn't find what they were looking for. So all the information was there, the utility was there, but they actually couldn't browse, search, or navigate the tool to actually get to the destination to do the job they wanted to do. And that all increased costs and drives down productivity. It creates a reliance on additional sources, causes a lot of time lost kind of trying to track down the information through a lot of tribal knowledge or through the help desk. And then often the other thing that we heard was that users, even if they found it, they didn't know which one was the right one. They didn't know which item was the right item, or they didn't know what information that specific form was looking for, both of which caused a lot of submission of incorrect information, which also caused a lot of manual rework and a lot of like additional time, labor, and opportunity cost for everybody involved in the processes. So how do we, now that we know that, we have examples of, we take a holistic approach of utility and usability. We start to understand how usability breaks down. How can we improve on usability without it becoming this overcomplicated, time-intensive thing that just becomes overwhelming while we're trying to do the rest of our jobs? So I've kind of boiled it down to 3 things. One, understand your users, and we'll talk about a couple of them on following slides, but try to start understanding basic user psychology, concepts like heuristics, which are just common mental models that we all apply when we approach a digital experience. And from that, you can start to make a lot of really good informed decisions. And then improve content. So content is a tricky one. Oftentimes, well, I'll talk a little more about it in the next slide, but improve categorization, use non-technical language, try to find ways to speak to the user rather than just distributing your information to the user. Try to use the language and the categories and the vernacular that they're used to. And then promote learnability. This one is important, but it's also important to mention that learnability is only a last resort. So oftentimes we'll layer on helper text, but we'll only fix a symptom instead of fixing the problem. And so it's super important to differentiate. Learnability should only be leveraged when complexity is irreducible. And if we go back to the astronaut example, it would be like giving the astronauts a 700-page user manual while they're on the lunar rover on the moon. They don't have time to do that, right? They don't have time to sit and read a manual to try to figure out how to use something. So learnability is important, but it's a last resort. So understand your users. I already talked to this a little bit, but talk to them. Find a small group of representative users, talk to them. Play into their natural biases. We all have biases. Sometimes that's a bad thing. In user experience, we leverage it. We use it to our benefit. So, basic user psychology. What is the user's expectations when they come to this tool? What are their mental models? And then heuristics, which I already talked a little bit about, which are just mental shortcuts. It's a fancy word, but it just means mental shortcuts that we all, kind of expectations that we all have when we come to a tool. And if you want to learn more about any of that, I heard that this session is full now, but this would be a good session to follow up on. And I also learned that we're actually, for the first time, we're recording these sessions, and we're actually going to be publishing these sessions to the Knowledge site after Knowledge. So you can always go back to that and watch any of the sessions if you're a registered attendee. So you can dive into any of this at your own pace. And then the content and understanding and organization, we often refer to this as information architecture. Where it gets a little tricky is developers and engineers often have a different definition of information architecture, which is much more like a strict data model of the platform. And that is not the same as user experience information architecture. Often, if you take a one-size-fits-all approach and you try to surface that technical knowledge to your end users, they will often get confused, they'll get lost, they won't understand what you're trying to tell them. So user-facing information architecture, user-facing categorization, labels, vocabulary, language, all of those are really good to promote usability. And Josh Ortiz is also doing, I don't know if you've signed up for it, but he's also doing a great kind of content lab that you can watch in Knowledge, or on the website afterwards if it's full. So what are some of the ways, I talked earlier about measuring, what are some of the ways that you can measure and actually prove to the business the value? A lot of the common quantitative ways, let me back up a little. So quantitative will give you the what. If you use quantitative measures, it will actually tell you what's happening, what's going wrong. It'll start to give you some scale, some volume, like how frequently is this happening. And we use things like time on task. So how long did it take the user to complete this form? And if it's way too long, how can we look at reducing that? From the time they land on the page to the time they hit submit. How can we use it to identify problem areas, and then if it happens frequently, we use it to prioritize problem areas. And then we also can follow up with a measurement and use it to demonstrate that we improved it, therefore demonstrating that we have added value through improving productivity, and we can start to monetize that and show the scalability of it over however many times that form is submitted over the course of a year or 5 years. And then error rates, how frequently are they submitting the wrong information? And if there's a high error rate, chances are you have a usability problem that you need to address. Time to completion is a lot like time on task, but it might be a little broader. So you might be looking at, from the time they land on the portal, or they land on the experience, till the time they finish the job to be done, which is multiple pages, multiple clicks. How long does it take them to complete that whole journey? And that one's a little harder because it's less granular, so you can start to get some general usability problems, but maybe not some specific ones. And then things like abandonment rates on forms. They landed on the form, but they didn't complete it. Or escalations or reassignments. Sometimes on the agent side, that can be a problem if we're seeing a lot of escalations and reassignments. So use it to identify the problems and prioritize the problems through seeing the commonality of it. And then you want to dig into the why. So why are those problems happening? So you found the what, and now you want to dig into why. We can use things, which is much more of a qualitative measure. You want to talk to users. You want to actually dig a little deeper into the problem. So we can use things like user interviews, talk to a handful of users. But you can also use things like the idea portal. I'm going to go out of order a little. The idea portal, where we have an idea portal template. It's basically a Reddit-like framework, right? Where you might have used it for us, for submitting ideas to ServiceNow. I think we have an idea portal, right? But it's a great way to identify problems, get user feedback, but then also to prioritize problems, because it has a Reddit-like functionality to upvote. And the more upvotes you have, the more likely it is that a lot of users are having the same problems. And you can use that to inform your decision-making. And then we have the system usability scale, which is more like a survey. It's big. You do it maybe year over year to demonstrate the improvement over time. So you can, again, you can use it to identify the problems and the reasoning for the problems, but then you can also do that same form year over year, and you can start to see improvement, or the areas of improvement. So we talked about the business value, we talked about utility versus usability, we talked about some of the ways you can dig into usability, but how do you parse that down? How do you operationalize that? How do you make it manageable while you're all very, very busy? And if you don't have whether it's a department or whether it's a small group of capacity constrained people, this model still applies. So the first thing you can do, carve out 10 to 20% of your capacity. Just commit some time, a time block that you are willing to use to focus on usability. That's the key to start. You won't let it get overwhelming. You won't let it spiral out of control due to the complexity, because these problems are complex. And then you set up a dashboard or an idea portal. You start collecting information. You start collecting data. And then you use that data to identify the problems. And then once you identify the problems, you talk to 5 users about those specific problems. And now you have an understanding of what's happening, how frequently it's happening, and why it's happening. And from there, you can create a solution. You can solve one problem at a time. Since you're resource constrained, you're only limiting your commitment to 10 to 20%, boil it down to the most important problems first, brutal prioritization. Solve a specific problem one at a time, and you'll recognize the value of it year over year. And then lastly, measure the outcome and repeat. The most important step. Make sure that the thing you did offered the business value that you think that you wanted, that it created the outcome that you wanted. Sometimes it will and sometimes it won't, and you'll have to do this process again. But if it does, you've demonstrated business value. You can now justify the expense and the focus and the prioritization and the capacity being committed to it. And the most important part, as I mentioned in one of the earlier slides, is repeat. Just have a simple, repeatable process that you can apply over and over again. So these slides will be on the Now community, but these are some additional resources. Some of them are links to some of the articles that I mentioned earlier, some of the content that I had at the beginning. Now Create has a very comprehensive process for approaching this. I wouldn't try to learn it all at once. It's more like a reference material that you can kind of go to when you want to learn one specific thing. But it's a great reference and resource for you all. There's a link to a heuristics evaluation form if you want to start digging into like what are heuristics and how do I apply these concepts to usability problem identification. All great resources. So in summary, in closing, yes, we all want lightsabers, 100%. Innovation is in our DNA. We are creators. We want to create new things to solve problems. Absolutely. But in the meantime, until that happens, let's all keep our axes sharp. Thank you very much.